And this goes through church history. You have the Greek, the Roman Catholic stream, and then you had this other stream of the persecuted church, and literally they can calculate there was millions of people killed over the centuries by the Roman Catholic Church. It's something that, you know, people like to sanitize in our day. And it kind of reminds me, I joke with Nina, we have a few relatives that they'll have a fight with you, and they'll get angry and flip out and do a bunch of things, and then they'll just disappear for 6 months, and then they show up again, and instead of acknowledging it and saying, you know, I'm sorry about what happened, or acknowledging it somehow, they just don't say anything about it. Just say, hey, like 6 months went by, so now let's just forget how we left off. I was cussing at you and throwing stuff at you and all of that, and now it's just, hey. So these are obviously some unsaved relatives, but it always made me chuckle, because I said, well, I guess that's one way to deal with it. If you don't have the life skills to deal with when you messed up and you broke a relationship, you just go away for 6 months and come back and say, hey, how's it going? And if the person forgives you, I guess you just don't have to deal with it. So this is kind of what the Roman Catholic Church did. They let a few centuries go by, and they changed their tactics. And so what you see resurfacing in the 1800s is you see the Roman Catholic Church started to buy up Bible publishers. That's when that started in the 1800s. So they had a new strategy. They have control over, a large amount of control over what gets published in the way of English Bible translation, not just English, but that's one of the major ones. And so they began to push this Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, this narrative. But this is an ancient battle that's been going on since 325, and really even before that in some form. So it's interesting when you start seeing these Hebrew Gospels reemerging, those 16 verses that were removed, they're all there. They're all in the original Hebrew. They were definitely removed by the Roman Catholic Church. And like I said, if you read the history, even in their own words, they were trying to replace Israel. And that's where that's why I speak against these things. It's not prejudice, and it's certainly not that I want to be associated with. There's some people get really dark about this stuff. I don't really like that, but you know, it's what people do with the information. They take this information, and some people, they will take this information and they go dark. I'll call it that. They're just not equipped with the maturity or something to deal with seeing the dark side of things. And this can happen on both ends of the issue. As they like to say, there can be a ditch on both sides of the road, right? So on the one side of the road, you get these people who go dark, we'll call it. They kind of go off the deep end and get a lot weird. And that scares people. People can even get what I'd call cult-like sometimes with this stuff. You have to be careful. It has to. People need to pray and fast just like anything, and seek the Lord and come at this thing to find His solution, and not to get in the flesh and get off on some strange tangent. But on the other side of the ditch, you have, and to their shame, often even church leaders who ought to know better, and they have their stick their head in the sand approach. So they don't want to deal with it. They don't want it to have happened or be a problem. So they just say, well, we're just going to ignore it. We're going to minimize it. We're going to stick our head in the sand. We're going to pretend that it's not really the problem that it is. And you get that very commonly in today's American church. You get that in today's Canadian American church, where they very commonly have the stick your head in the sand approach, right? Don't talk about these things. That was hundreds of years ago, the Protestant Reformation, the millions of people that were persecuted and killed for these truths and freedoms that we enjoy. Everything's changed. It's not really as dark as it seems. They're not really changing the Bible. They're not really pushing this Greek anti-Jewish replacement theology back on the church. So they stick their head in the sand. So you get both approaches, and both are equally dangerous and equally extreme and strange and cult-like, in my opinion, both to be equally avoided. We have to open our eyes to what's going on. And as I've said before, we don't focus on the dark side to the point where we obsess about it, but we seek the Lord about it, and we find out what he wants us to know about it. And if I'm putting a percentage to it, 5% is on this side. Of course, there's different seasons. We have a different focus, but in general, 5% is focusing on the problem, and 95% is focusing on seeking the Lord in the solution. And that'll help you keep you on the road in balance and not off on one ditch on one side or one ditch on the other side. And when you study history, where Easter came from was in 325 AD, and Easter was put in place to replace Passover, to replace the Jew. So 325 AD is when Easter replaced Passover. And up until that point, a large segment of the church was still celebrating Passover, even in 325 AD. And what Eusebius and Constantine said, they came up with replacement theology. And they said that the Roman Catholic Church was replacing Israel. So Eusebius was the church guy and Constantine was the emperor, right? That's the state and the church. And Eusebius is the one that came up with the 3.5-year ministry of Yeshua, which was actually only around a year, according to all the church fathers. And according to the scriptures and the timeline, it was 70 weeks is what I think it was. But it's for certain that all the church fathers said it was just a little over a year, the ministry of Yeshua. And there's so many confirmations of that. But the very first person to come up with 3.5 years was Eusebius. And he did that under Constantine's orders, because Constantine wanted a theology that would support replacement theology. And they needed the 3.5 years to deal with the prophecies in Daniel. And I'm not going to get into all the details of it, but the book of Revelation, what they taught, what Eusebius taught, was that the book of Revelation had already taken place. That the book of Revelation was 70 AD, when Israel ceased to be a nation. That was God's judgment on Israel, and that was the baton being passed from Israel to the church. That Israel no longer existed, the Jewish people no longer existed, and they were rebels to be wiped out, and that this was all in Revelation. But to make the timeline work, because they needed to account for the 7 years in Daniel, they took 3.5 years for Yeshua's ministry and 3.5 years for Revelation. And that's what Eusebius came up with under Constantine. And that was one of the things that they foisted upon the church at that point. And when I say foisted, he was the emperor, the Roman Empire. So he had a lot of power, and then the Roman Catholic Church had a lot of power. Like I said, millions of people were literally killed over the centuries, anyone who resisted this. This was not optional. And so the church, the people who wanted to stay true to things, they had to a lot of times go underground and be persecuted for keeping the Passover. It was made illegal to keep the Passover. It was made illegal to do the Sabbath, to worship on the Sabbath. What they were told is these are the things that Constantine and Eusebius all did, and I'm talking by official orders. They replaced the Sabbath with Sunday, which is why it's called Sunday, right? It's a day to worship the sun god.
Yeah.
So, and they came up with Christmas, which Christmas, December 25th, goes back to astrology, to the Babylonians, eventually the Tower of Babel, I suppose, but historically for sure you can trace it back to Babylon, Babylonians. That's Babylon got its name from Tower of Babel. And the Babylonians were geniuses in math, and they were geniuses in astronomy and astrology. So what the Babylonians had in their astrology, it went really deep, but they had 36 principalities, or chief gods, small g, and some of them were the heads over constellations, and then you had the sun god was their chief god over all of them, and then you had the moon god was, I think, second in command, if I remember right, and then you had, I'm just going to say 34 constellations, 36. And they were mathematicians and astrologers and astronomers, and if you take 1 plus 2 and you add that together and get 3, right? And then you add the next consecutive number. Let's say we're counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So 1 plus 2, you get 3, and then you add the next number, 1, 2, 3, and you get 6, and then you add the next number to that. You take the sum 6 there, and you add 4, right? So we're going consecutively the whole way to 36. That number adds up to 666. And in the Babylonian system, when you added together the stars in these constellations and the sun and the moon god, you had 666 stars. 664, I guess, plus the sun and the moon. And they had what they called their magic squares, which isn't the easiest thing to do mathematically. But if you take the numbers 1 through 36 and you just take them and randomly scatter them, right? And you use each number once, and I'm just going to pretend I did that, and you fill it all in. What a magic square is it arranges those 36 numbers so that every row and every column adds to 111. That's why I say this isn't very easy to do. So no matter which row you're adding or which column you're adding, all 6 going this way and all 6 going that way and diagonally. So you have 14 different ways you can add that across that all add to 111. And if you add all the numbers, like I just said, 1 through 36, you get 666. So they minted a coin in Babylon, and they had this magic square on the one side of the coin with the 666. And they said, this is the number of the sun god. On the other side of the coin, they had an inscription of worshiping the sun god. And 111 is significant in the Hebrew. If you remember when I talked about the letter Aleph, the letter Aleph represents God. And if you add up the numerical value and you spell out Aleph, like we do in the case of a word, right? And you get the Aleph is 111, something the rabbis talk about. So 111 has to do with God. So it's not a coincidence that they had 111 being one of their numbers, because they're trying to replace God. This is the Antichrist religion. This is Satan, the fallen angel, who wanted to replace God. And they determined in ancient Babylon that the worship of this sun god would take place near the winter solstice. Makes sense, because it's the sun god, right? So the winter solstice happens in December. Now, I think it happens around December 21st,
yeah,
more or less, right? And I'm not sure why they came up with it the way they did, but they'd have a week-long celebration around the time of the winter solstice. And in their religion, the days were getting shorter and shorter, the sun was diminishing, right? But after the winter solstice, the sun would begin to increase. The experience of the sun god, where the enemies of the sun god tried to finish it off, but the sun god could not be defeated, and so the sun god recovered and began to increase again around this winter solstice. And on December 25th was the day to celebrate the rebirth of the sun god.